System review time. Right then, it's time for the much anticipated and much delayed Sinclair ZX81 system review. First, the boring bit, specifications. This thing's got a Z80A CPU running at 3.25 MHz. The original Z80 was made by Zilog, but later models have a NEC equivalent. Sound, none whatsoever. This thing has no sound. Display is 64 by 48 black and white, so we're talking major low resolution, and I'll talk a little bit more about the graphics later on. Some very clever machine code was used in later software which could generate 256 by 192. This was done by overriding the interrupt service routine, whatever that means. Memory, it had 8K of ROM, which included a version of BASIC, and RAM was 1K, which was expandable to 16K using this, the legendary 16K RAM pack, about which I'll talk a bit later. Released in 1981 for just under £70 pre-made and just under £50 in kit form, the ZX81 was the successor to this, the Sinclair ZX80. It was basically not exactly a redesign, it was an improvement of the ZX80. The chip count was reduced greatly. 18 chips in the ZX80 were reduced down to one chip called a ULA, standing for Uncommitted Logic Array, which was basically a dog's body do everything chip, designed by Jim Westwood, Sinclair's chief engineer, and produced for Sinclair by Ferranti. It's also worth comparing the chip count of the ZX81 with that of the Tandy TRS-80 Model 1, which was a contemporary of the ZX81. That had a chip count of 44, which just goes to show how efficiently this system was made, though it should also be said its capabilities were significantly lower as well. The ULU's functions, well, it basically did everything except contain the ROM, the RAM and the CPU. So it synchronized the screen display, it generated a 6.5 MHz clock, which was double that of the CPU's clock speed. It controlled audio in and out, keyboard operation, basically detected key presses, controlled system timing. One of the quirks of the ULU was that it used the same pin for video output as it used for tape audio input. Anyone familiar with the ZX81 will know that when you load a game or program from tape, the screen is filled with black jagged stripes. It wasn't intended to do that, it was just a quirk, but it actually turned out to be really useful because you could use that to tell whether your volume was set right. If the black lines were too thick, it was too loud and quite often resulted in failed loading. If they were too narrow, it was too quiet. And with a bit of experience, you could tell just by looking at the screen whether you got your volume set correctly. Another improvement over the ZX80 was the inclusion of slow video mode. The ZX80 was absolutely incapable of maintaining a video signal while it was doing anything. So if it was running program code, your screen went blank. If you pressed a key on the keyboard, your screen went blank, which was basically a pain in the arse. It looked awful. There were some very clever ways around it to create games, chasing the beam effectively. The very clever machine code programmers could make the code run in the very short period of time where the display beam was either at the top or the bottom of the screen. It took some very clever coding and wasn't at all easy to do. But largely, ZX80 games, where they existed at all, were complete flicker fests. The ZX81, they created a mode called Slow, where most of the CPU time was dedicated to maintaining the display. And again, it kind of did in basic what the machine code programmers had been doing with the ZX80. It made the code run when the display wasn't being maintained, just for a very brief period of time, which basically made your basic programs run incredibly slowly. But at least it didn't flicker, which was nice. A little bit of history then. Jim Westwood, Sinclair's chief engineer, started developing the ZX81 before the ZX80 was even brought to market. As I said earlier, he reduced the chip count hugely, creating the ULA chip. They were only supposed to use 70% of the logic gates on this, but Sinclair, basically wanting to get the absolute maximum they could out of the thing, used all of the logic gates, which allegedly caused overheating problems. There's some myth about putting a milk bottle on the top of your ZX81 to stop it overheating. I personally have never had that problem, and I think it's a myth. But there you go, that's a little snippet from Wikipedia. Believe that if you want to. There were improvements over the ZX80's ROM in the ZX81. Apart from the improved BASIC, this included new math functions, including the ability to work with floating points. The ZX80 was only able to work with whole numbers. However, early models had a bug which gave inaccurate results when calculating square roots, and this forced Sinclair to offer replacements to a lot of customers. Manufactured in Dundee, Scotland by Timex Corporation, the ZX81 was launched on the 5th of March 1981 and was accompanied by a really impressive manual. Now let me show you this manual, because I've got it here. I read this back in the day and taught myself, well, alright, learned that I was rubbish at programming BASIC, but it is really cool. And you just don't get this kind of thing with computers anymore. Can you imagine buying a modern PC and having a manual with it that told you how to use Windows? This thing is fantastic. It teaches you the built-in BASIC that comes with the ZX81, and it teaches you really well. It holds your hand all the way, teaches you in a way that even I could understand up to a point. I have always been rubbish at programming, but this total BASIC for layman, and it gets as advanced as you want to up to a point. It doesn't go into machine code, though I'm sure it goes into peeks and pokes and stuff. That all got over my head. But it is a fantastic manual, and that came with it. And you just don't get that anymore, which is a real shame. As a point of interest, the ZX81 was entered into a competition by the BBC to be the computer featured in a computer program, TV program that the BBC were making. It went up against the Grundy New Brain. I'm not sure that it was actually made by Grundy at that time, but anyway, the New Brain, which was withdrawn from the competition, and the Acorn Proton. Amusingly, the Proton at the time of the competition didn't even exist as a prototype. It was just an idea and a set of drawings. There was no hardware, but the Acorn machine won. And Clive Sinclair was really pissed off. The Acorn machine is the machine we now know and love as the BBC Micro Model A and B, and that went on to the Master and on to the Archimedes and all of that. Clive Sinclair was incredibly pissed off because not only did his computer exist, it had a thriving user base already, and he thought, well, this was incredibly unfair. Though, to be fair, the Acorn was the better machine. Yes, vastly more expensive, but also more rugged and more capable. ZX81s in a classroom maybe wouldn't have survived. They are a little on the fragile side. They are fantastic for learning to program, but as a functional machine, not so good. So probably the BBC made the right choice. Now, being a really basic computer, and it should be noted, it has no moving parts whatsoever. You've got that touch-sensitive keyboard, and it is actually quite sensitive for all that you can't tell whether your fingers are on it or not. When they actually are on it, it does respond really surprisingly well. So, no moving parts, no proper keyboard, no on-off switch. Shock horror. If you want to turn the power off, you've got to pull the power lead out, which is a bit of a scary thing. Yeah, so really basic. 1K of RAM, which was fairly useless for doing much of anything. If you've seen the videos of the games that I put on YouTube, you will know what I mean. So, an almost compulsory piece of equipment was this, the 16K RAM pack. It works. It makes it into a functional, useful computer, but I'm not going to pull this off because I'll explain why. It plugs into an edge connector at the back, and I'll show you the innards of one of these in a minute. The problem with these is they don't make a good connection at all. They wobble. I don't know if you can see that, but this one I am very, very fortunate in that it does make a good connection and is fairly stable, but they were legendary for being unstable. If you had it running and you pressed a key and it moved even slightly, this thing would break the connection and your computer would crash. And this would happen 2, 3, 4, 5 times per session using it. The phenomena became known as memory wobble. And I had a computer back in the day, I had one of these, and it suffered chronic memory wobble to the point that it killed the ZX81. Like how if you've got a cartridge-based console and you plug your cartridge in while the console's turned on, you're going to wreck it. You have to turn it off. And this, it would short out, you know, and if it had really bad memory wobble, like mine did, it could kill the computer. I don't know how many ZX81s died because of that. But yes, there was a thriving peripherals market. Not only were there RAM packs, there were apparently joystick interfaces. I would guess that they had to have a pass-through port to be able to plug this into the back of them. That being the case, I'd dread to think how stable, or otherwise they would have been. There were printer interfaces for the funny little Sinclair printer that was like printed on rolls of tinfoil, thermal stuff, paper-ish. Keyboard overlays, like rubber keys that fitted over the top of this, which wouldn't have increased sensitivity but would have let you know when your fingers were on the keys, which is something I have complained about whilst playing games on this thing. Numerous peripherals for them. There was a thriving market. So, okay, Sinclair made a very basic, very primitive computer, but a whole industry grew up around it, which was fantastic. Now, while the ZX81 is mainly known in the UK, it did get cloned all over the place, and there are some official licensed versions as well. There was an officially licensed version made in China, surprisingly. You would expect there to be like unlicensed clones there, but no, they had an official version. And also Timex licensed it and sold it in the US. There are in fact 2 versions in the US. There was the Timex Sinclair 1000, which is virtually identical to this, except that it had 2K of RAM instead of 1. This did reasonably well initially, except that Timex didn't make the RAM packs readily available. So people bought the computer, found that they couldn't do anything remotely useful with it because it only had 1K of RAM, and it got thrown in the cupboard and forgotten all about. And they died a death because no one could upgrade it. And then there was another model released a bit later called the Timex Sinclair 1500, which looked a lot more like this, the Sinclair Spectrum. It had the same rubber keyboard, same general shape of the case, and it had 16K of RAM. So it had all the graphical and CPU capabilities of the ZX81. 16K was basically this crammed into this, which kind of makes it a good stopgap for the Spectrum, except that by that time there were more capable computers in America selling cheaply. The VIC-20 was already selling for about $100 at that time. So a 16K ZX81 didn't make any sense. So they failed. Right, let's have a look at the side here. You've got your power input there, which takes a 9-volt power supply with a 1/4-inch little mini jack plug. Mic and ear, they are for input and output to and from a normal cassette tape recorder, which is used for data storage. You can load your programs off of there and save them onto there. And that's kind of a novelty. It's something that we're very used to in the UK, and it's something of a rarity in America, because in the US floppy disk was a much more common format. They weren't at all common here, certainly not in the early days. TV output, that's just an RF out, normal, goes into your TV aerial socket. The keyboard on these is freaky. Apart from it being a touch-sensitive membrane thing, you don't type on this. It's got predefined keywords. So basically, if I was to press go to, it would just put go to on there, and you've got like red words where you have to press your shift key, and the red word will come up, and variations of shift and function to get the various different symbols that are on the keys. These here, these blocks, they are the graphic elements. There are no high resolution graphics on this thing. It just has a series of oddly shaped blocks that you put together to make your on-screen graphics, and they are big and they are chunky. You will have seen that by now if you've been watching the other videos that I've been putting up. It's, given the kind of keyboard that this thing has, putting these predefined words onto the keys made sense, because you just can't type quickly on a touch-sensitive keyboard like this. But it does get confusing sometimes when you can't quite work out how to get the word or the symbol that you want. If you're not used to it, it can be confusing. But it made sense. You just had to get used to the machine. Okay, just out of curiosity, because I've never opened one up before, I took the bottom off of this other ZX81, because I have two, because I'm greedy. Actually, I was given one. Thank you, Rob, in Shropshire. He gave me one. That sounds wrong, doesn't it? He gave me a spare ZX81. This is what it looks like inside. Now, how simple is that? What have you got? Ferranti ULA. So that's basically the dog's body do everything chip. Here you've got an NEC thing. I'm guessing that's the RAM. This is the Z80A. It's an original Zilog Z80A. And that is some Ferranti thing. Is it? No? Wait, I can't read it. No, it's a Mostec chip. I'm guessing that's the ROM. I could be wrong. And there you've got your TV modulator. And that's it, really. There are your audio inputs and outputs and power thingy. Some kind of heatsink thing there. Ribbon to your keyboard. And that's it. It's tiny. Let me... There. Just so you can get an impression of the size. That's a normal audio cassette tape. It's... These things are small and very light, incredibly light. And yes, they're cheap, but my God, they don't outlast. You know, these things are 30 years old and well, totally reliable. Having said that, back in the day, I suppose any ZX81 you come across that's working now will be a good one, but apparently about a third of them failed. Clive Sinclair said that was because it was people making their own ones, because you could buy them either in kit form or pre-made. And he said it was people buying them in kit form and basically putting them together wrong, bodging the soldering, putting the chips on the wrong way around, basically bodging it. But a lot of the pre-manufactured ones failed as well. W.H. Smith famously ordered usually about a third more than they needed just to account for failures and returns. But that's definitely not an issue these days. If you get one, it'll be a good one, because all the ones that were going to die have died already. So there we go. Basically, to summarize, the ZX81 was a very simple, very cheap computer. They sold initially for just under £70 pre-assembled, just under £50 in kit form. And while they weren't a practical computer, you couldn't do a lot with them, what they were fantastic for and intended for was to teach you how to program in BASIC and get the idea of how computers worked. They were cheap, you could give them to your kids and let them learn how to program. It was basically the ideal cheap first computer. They weren't about gaming, they weren't about being a business computer, anything like that, to use a certain catchphrase. They were about learning to program on the cheap. And at that, they were fantastic. And I have to admit, my feelings of nostalgia towards these things have surprised me. I actually find, though it is fairly crap in terms of its capabilities, I like this machine more than most of the ones I've used over recent months and years. I like this more than the Spectrum, though it's less capable. I like it more than the Commodore 64. I like it more than the Amstrad. You've got to go up to the Amiga before you find a computer I like more than this. None of which is relevant to this review. It's just my opinion and, yeah, personal preference there. But it's a fantastic computer, and it's such a shame it's largely overlooked in the rest of the world. There you go. Sinclair ZX81, a not entirely objective system review. As a final point of interest, you can find a bit more information about this system on my website, link below. There are also links there to custom searches on eBay to buy both this and the Timex Sinclair models that were made in the US. Well worth checking out. Thank you for watching.